Betsy Johnson, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and chit-chat about some of the things that we think most Oregonians really want to know about their candidates for governor. And the first one, which is probably generating the most response, whether it's nationally or here in Oregon, is the issue of a woman's right to choose and abortion. How far will you go to protect Oregon's current laws when it comes to reproductive rights?
Well, I'm pro-choice. I was on a Planned Parenthood board before Tina Kotek came to Oregon. Under Governor Johnson, Oregon will stay pro-choice. I've voted for many of the bills, all the bills, that memorialized Oregon's policy position. And so under Governor Johnson, Oregon would stay pro-choice.
Yeah. If a bill came to your desk as governor that weakened Oregon's right to choose, abortion laws, how would you react to that? Would you veto that?
I would not sign it. I would not. I would veto it, yes, because, yes, I'd veto it.
And if the opposite happened and there was a bill that came to your desk strengthening those rights?
I don't know. Oregon's policy position is very, very clear. We have one of the most pro-choice set of statutes of any state in the union. I don't know how you could strengthen it, but at my core, I'm pro-choice.
Yeah. Oregon suffers from an urban-rural divide, as you know, and so many states do. Do you have a plan to help mend that divide, or do you think that's even necessary?
Oh, absolutely, I have a plan. Let me start by saying I grew up in what was then rural Central Oregon. I was born in Bend and grew up in Redmond. And so I understand and speak the vocabulary of rural places. Also, when I was in the legislature, I represented Tillamook, Clatsop, Columbia, Western Washington County, which is agricultural largely, and the working waterfront under the St. John's Bridge. The farther east you go in this state and the farther south you go in this state, the angrier people are. They feel disrespected, looked down on, disenfranchised. And so I think that several things I would do as governor. First, go there. Kate Brown has spent most of her administration hiding in Salem. I would go to those places and then recognize that the economies throughout Oregon are different. I don't care whether you make wood chips, silicon chips, potato chips, fish and chips. We have different economies, and the governor needs to understand that, recognize it, needs to come with humility to ask local elected leaders, what does your place think about this? How can we do this together? Not do it to Oregonians, but do it with Oregonians. I would very much be an economic development champion. I have been that in the Oregon legislature and would continue to do that. But I think listening to the locals, having the locals define the problems, define the solutions, and then the state needs to be a faithful partner, specifically with money, in delivering on whatever the agreed upon collaborative solution is. So once you start getting some wins and rebuilding trust relationships, I think then you can go on from there. So take the low-hanging fruit. Get people to a point where they trust each other. They don't have to like each other, but trust each other. And get some early wins. There are opportunities throughout the state, but the big deal is when you're in Salem, answer the damn phone, and when you're not in Salem, you're out learning about some other place and how the state can be a faithful partner with that place.
Yeah. Let's talk about the unhoused situation here in the state of Oregon. I know that no matter where you are in the country, Oregon has been held up in many cases as kind of one of the worst offenders when it comes to allowing this situation to get out of control. How would you deal with our homeless crisis here in Oregon specifically?
Well, first of all, let me make a comment at 100,000 feet and drop down. The granddaughter of my old 5th grade teacher in Redmond called me. She lives in Bend. She left a message for me yesterday that her street here in Bend has been taken over with a homeless camp. Property values dropping like rocks. So what used to be perceived as a Portland problem isn't a Portland problem. It's an everywhere problem now. Unlike Tina and Christine, I actually have been doing something about it. I was part of a group of people who helped repurpose an abandoned jail built by Multnomah County, 151,000 square feet. We rehabilitated it from being a jail and looking like a jail into being a place of hope, recovery, reintegration. This is done in partnership with a not-for-profit called Helping Hands. And so we're providing a stable place for people to go and live. We got to stop debating what's the best methodology, because Portland has been almost paralyzed by the fight. Do you house first and then deal with the underlying problems that sent people to the streets? Or do you identify the problem and work out a treatment plan? We need all kinds of solutions. But what we really need to do is to treat this as though it is an emergency. I represented a small town in Northwest Oregon that was wiped out twice with 500-year floods in the space of a decade. And when that happened, we mobilized like that. We got all the right people at the table. We assigned duties and responsibilities. We had accountabilities, and we delivered. So the day after the election, when I'm the governor, I would convene those people, law enforcement, addiction specialists, mental health specialists, social service, and talk about what are budgets, what are realistic dates, who's the accountable person, and hold that person accountable. And if they don't deliver, get a new person. Enough of this. It isn't a lack of money, it's a lack of leadership. And in Portland, it has reached epidemic proportions. Now, part and parcel of that is to recognize that Oregon's laissez-faire attitude towards drugs is accelerating the crisis on the streets. We never should have passed, and I've worked against it and voted against it, but the Oregon voters passing ballot measure 110 was a catastrophe. And it has accelerated the crisis on the streets. But we are using the streets right now as a waiting room for mental health services, for housing. We got to stop that. We got to figure out how to build more housing across the spectrum, from single-family detached to tiny houses. We've got to end the lawless camping on the streets. We've got to move the tents off. There's an interesting lawsuit that's just been filed in Portland on the theory of ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And it'll be interesting to see how that goes through the court system. Because now with the proliferation of tents in some of the urban centers, it's forcing people that are confined to mobility devices like wheelchairs out into the street, where they're running over God knows what, and then they have to handle the wheels with their hands. But mostly we've got to take this seriously. We've got to act with urgency, and we've got to have accountabilities instead of just continuing to build these multiple not-for-profits that haven't moved the needle at all. And I would start with a proper inventory, census, to find out how many people are actually on the streets in a given place and what's their profile. Are they there because of poverty, mental illness, drug addiction? You've got to have a baseline to start from so that you know that you've moved the needle with any interventions.
There's something that people would argue may be part of this issue, and that is the minimum wage here at $13.50. Do you think that's enough? Not enough? Why?
Well, I ended up voting against the minimum wage construct that came through the legislature because of its complexity. It zoned Oregon in ways that I thought was unworkable. People need to be paid a decent wage for a decent day's work. Now, the problem you've got in Bend, especially, is the cost of living. When the mean price of a house is $800,000, where do those service jobs, where do those people live? And with the cost of gas, I mean, you're pushing part of your working population farther and farther away from their jobs, which has its own whole set of problems. We heard this morning at another meeting the lamentations of small business, saying that with the legislature continuing to interfere with how businesses are run in terms of determining working conditions, wage and hour, all of those sorts of things, small business is teetering on the brink. That's why I think an independent governor is so important, not hobbled by the agenda or the ideology of one of the partisan parties over the other, but rather somebody who can bring folks together and talk about this. Realistically, we need to have a hard conversation about expanding the UGB so that we can build more housing and try to make places like Bend more affordable. Bend is being loved to death by people who are what I refer to as equity refugees coming up from California and other places with huge sacks of money in their pocket, and they're buying houses and driving the price exponentially. But the calamitous cost of living, high price of homes, paucity of developable land. We have to build 580,000 units in the next 20 so years. We're better at pitching tents than we are pulling permits right now. And so it's probably a mosaic of solutions. But Central Oregon definitely has an affordability problem.
Let's move on to Measure 114, because this may very well be the most restrictive set of gun laws that any state has ever passed, if it passes. Where do you stand on that? Does it go too far, not far enough?
I'm opposed to it for a variety of reasons. First of all, it has multiple subjects in it. Secondly, in talking with local police chiefs, there is no funding mechanism for that ballot measure, and consequently it will fall on rural police departments, local police departments, to provide the training that hasn't been written yet. It's a very complex program to put in effect. I further think that it will continue to divide the state. We've polarized this gun conversation to gun, no gun. Tina wants to take all your guns. Christine has a whatever kind of attitude about it. It's fine just the way it is. I believe that a responsible gun owner, such as myself, who has the confidence of law enforcement, I've gotten the endorsement of the chiefs and the sheriffs, and have 90 working professionals that stand with my law enforcement coalition. I think that I'm exactly the kind of person to have the conversation. But to have Portland impose a Portland solution written by people who want all the guns off the streets, because this is kind of a circular thing that I think is a Second Amendment grab, is not the solution. We need to work together to find practicable and workable solutions that are not one political ideology imposing its will on others.
Has your campaign taken any money from the NRA?
No.
Yeah, simple as that. Divisive politics have made their way into the boardrooms of school systems all over the state, all over the country for that matter. How do we deal with the political discourse that has reached so deep and yet to such a shallow point in our regular lives?
Everybody needs to take a look at those scores that just came out last week. We are damaging our kids. Now, some of that was exacerbated by COVID. 2 years of being locked out of the classroom. Who knows what damage we've done emotionally, mentally. We certainly now can measure the academic damage that we've done. But we need to get back to core competencies in our classrooms. We need to stop using classrooms as cultural test beds. We need to get back to teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. Our kids are being shortchanged. I voted against the bill that Kate Brown and Tina Kotek promoted that lessens standards. I would toughen standards.
So beyond the standards issue, the question is, how do we protect school board members, superintendents, administrations for that matter, from the rancor of angry parents in these school board meetings, that many of which, depending on who you talk to, are there simply for political reasons to, I don't know, attempt to oust an administration?
Well, let me start by saying I believe in local control. School board members are responsible to their voters, and if it's bad enough from the voters' point of view, out they go. But we have allowed the teachers' unions to push politicization into our classrooms. Our classrooms ought to be focused on teaching the core subjects so that our kids are getting a diploma that means something and is not just a participation certificate. Our kids have got to have the kind of academic rigor that allows them to be accepted at community colleges, universities, trade schools, and we're not doing that now.
I'm guessing then what I'm hearing is that if we get back to the basics, we get these angry and sometimes out of control parents out of the boardroom?
I can't speak to that. One guy's out of control parent is another guy's First Amendment rights. I think our lack of civility and decorum in these meetings is appalling. But I also think that there's a certain righteous indignation among parents as COVID helped lay bare some of the things that are happening in the classroom that are antithetical to parents. Parents want to parent their kids. I think we ought to listen more to parents and more to classroom teachers and understand the difficulties in running a classroom. The legislature has interfered with classroom operations to a point that I think many classroom teachers are very, very frustrated. So get the teachers union and the politics out of the classroom. Let's educate our kids so they can compete in a global world.
Let's talk a little bit about water, finally. Here we have an issue and continued droughts. We don't see that really improving probably anytime soon. But there may end up being a choice one day. Recreation and wildlife versus agriculture, farming, and irrigation. Is that a choice you see as governor having to make eventually?
No. We shouldn't have to pick winners and losers. Let me start by saying drought in Central Oregon, and mercifully it was raining a little bit as I came in your building this morning, just a little bit. As somebody who grew up here, I always exhale when the first rains come, and it diminishes the possibility of conflagration. But we shouldn't be in this polarized place of picking winners and losers. There are all kinds of innovations to mitigate drought. There's got to come the realization that we have oversubscribed water in certain places. As you know from living here, nobody really knows all of the geology of Central Oregon, and there are very fragile places like the Metolius River where nobody knows the source of that. And you keep sticking straws in the aquifer, and pretty soon the river's gone, and everybody goes, God, I wish we hadn't done that. With the density of people that are moving to Central Oregon, we've got to recognize that oversubscription of water is a problem. There are innovations like one that happened in Umatilla, where farmers got together and set the problem statement, figured out what they were going to do to solve it, and then worked together to negotiate with environmentalists, the Indian tribes, and come up with a solution that included the farmers putting liens on their own property to get the money necessary to build the infrastructure. Now enter the state. The state needs to be a more reliable partner. We have not had a water agency running optimally. The legislature doesn't realize that the implementation of some of these big augmentation or mitigation projects takes multiple biennia to do. And so if you're going to ask people to reason together on water storage, water sequestration, do you put the canals into pipes? What all can we do in the innovation space to help use water more efficiently, that those are going to cost money, and the state needs to be a reliable partner. I'll just share with you over in the Pendleton area, the innovation that they're using there. I watched an older gentleman turn on thousands of acres of irrigation pivots with his telephone, and then is able to look at the phone and see that pivot number 11, the nozzle on that is plugged up, and send somebody out in a gator to fix it. That kind of innovation, being able to use aerial platforms to see where water is being distributed as it's watering a field or an orchard, and to understand that this corner is drier than it should be, or this corner is wetter. So we can use innovation that's happening at places like OMIC, the Oregon Manufacturing Innovation Center that I helped start. We can think less traditionally about open canals. Growing up over here, I'm well aware of the fact that there are open canals, and they're flowing right now. The evaporation, what do you do to change that? So there are a variety of techniques. I would turn to agriculture to help inform the whole menu of decisions.
Very good. I think that is about it.
Cool.
Thank you, Betsy Johnson, very much for taking the time to show up. I know you have a very busy schedule.
Well, thank you. It's been a
appreciate
pleasant
it.
conversation.
You bet.